Are you FaceTiming?
Just picture.
Oh.
My USB port just cracked out on my phone earlier though. So it's threatening to die any moment now.
Hey, I'm ready, guys. How are you? Good. You all set? I think we are, yeah. Excellent. Thank you for checking.
And there's still tons of time to go.
Imagine that.
No, I'm actually one of those weirdos who takes an actual investigate.
I'll forgive you. Oh, you know what I do?
Over here.
Can we turn off that front bank? Yeah, just because it blurs out the fonts. Perfect. They got all those screens. You know, I have the option yeah. That would have been good. Me too. Yeah, no, that's weird. I was just teasing you.
Y'all looking good?
Yeah, I noticed in the last session that it was actually, I could hear it coming back.
Like she could hear the audio coming back through.
Well, they told me to lower the volume right here. And I lowered it. It was on 58. Now I got it down to 40. You think I want it down a little lower?
I was in a different room and noticed it, but it was right behind me, so I mean, whatever you need to do.
That was
As long as you can operate your ear over there.
Well, that's the thing. Once we hit the record button, they tell us to get out because it's a conference. So I haven't recorded yet. I'm still waiting.
All right.
Whenever y'all ready, I'm recording, please.
According to my clock.
Bless you.
Thank you all.
Oh, yeah, I knew that.
Thumbs up. That was a good one.
Yeah, the 40 and 50.
Okay, perfect. Just so you know, yeah, the lungs are right over there.
I saw her demo that over there.
Okay.
This is just.
But yeah, this is coming down. Is that a good thing for you?
Love it.
No, I'm sure.
Okay.
I wish I could. I wish I could.
You like to smile.
I do.
Yeah, instead, stay ready. I think we'll do that. Thanks for your help.
That's not too Exactly. I'll get it.
All right. Our clock just struck 2:30, so we will get started here without further ado. Just to make sure you're in the right spot if you hadn't figured it out by now, this is Challenges of Securing Clinical Data in a Cloud-Centric World. I am Doug Edmonds from the UNC School of Law.
And I am Patty Kugakala from the University of California, Irvine School of Law. And I'm going to start off just giving a quick background of the UC Irvine School of Law. We opened our doors in the fall of 2009, so we're a very, very new school. And our clinical program started in the fall of 2011 with our first class coming in as third-year law students. When we started our clinical program, we looked at various case management tools, and of course the most popular one at the time was Time Matters. So we went ahead and implemented that in the spring of 2012. Well, after we implemented it, keep in mind, because we're in law school, we didn't have a lot of the historical data that much of you have. So when students were trying to input all of this information, they were looking at an interface that they thought was clunky, that they didn't think was as intuitive, and they thought it was cumbersome to use. We also limited access to the clinical information to be within the clinic, and so they thought that was very difficult because they're used to, working with mobile devices on various products. And so we started researching remote access capability, and the problem with that is that it started becoming very expensive because we had to look into virtualization, possibly remote access into the clinic, and we started researching other alternatives. One of our clinical faculty actually had heard about Clio and saw that some institutions started adopting it, as well as some legal firms, and so we decided to adopt it in the fall of 2012. Just a quick background on our clinical environment. We have 5 clinics that we call following the firm policy for information security. We have 4 clinics that don't necessarily fall under this because those clinics are run by adjunct faculty. We have, in the academic year of 2012-13, we have approximately 140 students with 8 full-time faculty, 7 adjunct faculty, and 1 clinic administrator. What makes our clinical program a little bit more unique than possibly some of yours is that our students are required to participate in a clinical program in order to graduate. So that means that every single one of our students will be going through the clinical program before they graduate. Our technical environment, just to give you an idea of how we've been using Clio, we actually have a hybrid environment. We use Clio for the case management, but we use a secure file server to store case file information. There are some files that we do load up on Clio with every case, but most of the working documents and most of the file storage that we have for each case is on our secure file server. Just to cover our firm policy, our law firm policy, since we moved to the cloud, was you must password protect your laptop and any mobile device that is accessing clinical information. If you're going to use a laptop, we require that you use or install antivirus software and any malware protecting software. And for the OS and third party, we strongly advise every student that's using their laptop to keep their products up to date. And they often ask me, well, how do I know if it's up to date? So we provide a tool called Secunia that allows them to check if it's up to date or not. We also say you cannot download anything to your laptop or any USB drive, and if you're going to do that, it has to be encrypted. And we're very clear that they cannot use products like Google Docs and Dropbox for clinical information. Another thing that we do that might be a little different is that for our students that are working in the clinic, we actually provide separate clinical email accounts for them. And the reason we do this is that when students leave the clinic, they sometimes may forget to store clinical email information with the case. And so with these clinical email accounts, we're very clear that they have no right to privacy on them, sort of like an employer-employee relationship. So when they leave the clinic, we actually have full access to that email account just in case we need to look up any email correspondence that may have left. Also, if a student is strongly suggested to leave the clinic and they choose not to put all that information on, we still have access to that account. We also encourage them to use different passwords between their student accounts and their clinical accounts, because student accounts often get breached, and so we don't want to assume that when a student account is breached that their clinical information was breached. And what our institution does, and I actually spoke to the assistant dean of the clinical program when we started the clinics, was I recommended that we, in their clinical orientation, take about 45 minutes to an hour to provide information security to all clinical faculty and students. And she allowed me to take an hour of her clinical orientation time to provide that training. And that's been very helpful for the clinical community. I think the biggest challenge that UCI Law faces is that we don't have a lot of, it's very hard for us to know for sure if all clinical students and faculty are following our policies. So we have all these great policies in place, but we're not entirely sure if they're following them. And when we find students that may not have password protected their phone or may not have password protected their laptop, then we educate them on why this is important, and then usually they comply. We still haven't figured out if there's egregious violations. There haven't been any, but if there are, we're still trying to figure out what exactly we would do with those students. The other challenge we have is that adjunct faculty, they usually have their own practices, and so they tend to want to use their own means of data storage and communication, and so it's kind of hard to force our firm policy on them, and so those are some of the challenges that we are currently facing. And Joe?
Talk about our environment at UNC School of Law. The law school itself was founded in 1845, and we like to brag about the fact that we were one of the first, or the first, state-funded universities in the country. 1795, we conferred the first degree, and so it was about 50 years later that the law school itself was founded by Professor William H. Battle, for whom many of the campus buildings remain named to this day. And in 1928 was when we first became accredited by the American Bar Association. So we have quite a long, illustrious history as compared to my distinguished colleagues here, but we're not going to get into that game. But it presents an interesting contrast to some of the challenges they faced as a new law school versus one that was long established like we've been. And so our use of, well, first of all, our clinical program, unlike Patty's, is optional. We do not require all our students to take clinical classes, and it's only the 3 Ls that do so. We historically were using the first sort of electronic case management tool that the law clinic began using was prior to my time there. I arrived in January of 2007. But way back in the 90s there, in 99, circa 99 to 2005, they were using a product called CaseMaster, which I believe is still out there. Some groups are still using it, from what I understand. That was sort of them tiptoeing into the world of managing their case files electronically rather than through the paper filing system, which still goes on to some extent as sort of a backup, as sort of a security blanket. And then a couple years prior to my arrival, they did sort of an RFP, request for proposals, and looked at a bunch of different vendors that were providing software to do case management. And from my understanding, again, this predates my arrival, but from my understanding, the reason that they ultimately chose Time Matters, and it's ironic given what happened later, was that it was one of the few packages that offered a web front end. So there was Time Matters World Server and Time Matters Enterprise Server. And so the Time Matters Enterprise is just a client server model. So like all the clinic lab stations had the Enterprise version installed, but students using their laptops could get to Time Matters via the web. It sounded good in theory, but in practice it never really worked well. One reason being that within a few years of this, probably around 2008 or 9, after I did arrive, we crested the 50% mark in terms of our students who were coming on as 1Ls with MacBooks. I mean, we don't have a laptop policy, so we don't dictate what students can or should bring. And I'm a Mac guy, so I was always willing to support Macs from the time I walked in the building in 2007. So as we saw the increase in the number of students who came toting MacBooks, it became difficult to support them as far as Time Matters went, because it just wasn't as functional. And I like to tell this anecdote, and forgive me if there's a Lexus rep in here, but I called their tech support one day and I said, look, on your website you still advertise that Time Matters works with Macs, that you support the Mac OS. And after digging a little bit and kind of pressing this person, he finally said, well, yeah, we do for pre-Intel model Macs. I'm like, they stopped making PowerPC MacBooks in like 2006 maybe, so that's kind of a specious argument to be offering that you support Macs when in fact everybody that's walking into law school nowadays is probably going to have an Intel-based chipset. So anyway, it was a problem, and it reached a breaking point in the fall of 2010 when we had done a major upgrade to Time Matters. We upgraded to version 10.0 that fall, and it was sort of a train wreck, and I take partial responsibility and ownership for that because I wasn't probably paying as much attention as I should have been and had my sysadmin focused on it, but I didn't really get as involved as I might have been, and it was just a poor implementation. It didn't work well. We had more problems after the upgrade than before, so the faculty were increasingly frustrated, the students were increasingly frustrated. And so it was at that point in the fall of 2010, going into winter 2011, when we did a really hard look at all the alternatives that existed to us at that point. And we looked at Rocket Matter, Clio, and Amicus Attorney. So of course Amicus was very similar to Time Matters insofar as it's sort of a client-server model, but both Rocket Matter and Clio were cloud-based and are cloud-based. And ultimately we chose Clio for a lot of different reasons that I won't get into now. That was my talk that I gave last year, some of you might have seen. But in any case, in the fall of 2011, we moved over to Clio. And in fact, the frustration level was so high with Time Matters at the time that we had not managed to work out the service level agreement and the terms of service with Clio as of August, when the semester was starting and as the clinical students for that term were going to matriculate. And so we couldn't quite pull the trigger and migrate over from Time Matters before the fall semester. But again, the level of frustration was so high several weeks into the semester that I went to the clinic director and I said, Tom, look, I'm ready to go. Like, I'll do it over fall break if you're willing to go with me and tell the students they're going to have to get retrained in Time Matters midway through the semester. Originally, we were just going to wait until the holidays and wait until the start of the spring semester to cut over, migrate all the data. But he said, yeah, let's green light this. Let's go ahead and do it. So we shut down the Time Matters server on a Thursday evening or Friday afternoon, I forget which. And I spent my entire fall break weekend migrating documents, and we work very closely with Clio. They have a great migration team that does all the matter records and the contacts. So that's the main guts of their migration process, but the documents themselves have to be manually migrated. So we did that, and we've never looked back. We've been very happy sort of in the cloud since then. So for our academic year, the current academic year, as Patty showed, we've got 6 clinics, and they are all operating under the same sort of firm policy like Patty discussed, where we have a set of best security practices and workflow that we try to dictate to the students and the faculty themselves, although they're a little bit harder to herd than the students. I think you can all relate to that. We do have one sort of outlier, and it's not even one of our clinics, but we have several centers, like many of you probably do at your law schools. It's the Center for Civil Rights, but they do some actual casework and some big cases involving a lot of documents, in fact. And their needs do tend to vary from the clinical program, and in fact, it was only recently that I learned that they were using Clio in sort of a different way and kind of not abiding by all the exact best practices that we had tried to put out there for the clinic, but they do still find it very useful, and they are storing a lot of their documents in Clio, but they also, sort of like when Patty mentioned that they are storing some of their case documents locally, the Center for Civil Rights continues to rely on our NetApp backend, on our network shares, much to my chagrin and horror when I found that out just a few weeks ago, because I'd really like for everybody to be putting everything into Clio. But in any case, we do have about 70 students from any given year to the next, because again, it's just the 3 Ls. And there are 8 full-time faculty and 3 full-time staff in the clinic. And they're very much involved with the sort of day-to-day, month-to-month administration of the case management software, although my shop provides all the technical support. The clinical staff are the only ones that create new matters in Clio. The students don't do that. The staff alone close matters, so the students have to report to them when a case is finished that they're going to close it. So there's a lot of coordination at that level, and the staff, I will say, has been very supportive of all those efforts. So as we prepared for this talk, some of you probably recall on the Tech Notes list, we sent out a survey back in the early part of May, and we just polled people as to what they were using for case management software and whether they were sort of moving to the cloud or not. And we got a pretty good number of responses from all across the US. The one area we didn't, I'm going to signal her out, is from the Southwest. We didn't get any from there in New Mexico or Arizona.
I was on vacation. Fishing.
All right, fair enough, Cindy. But it was pretty indicative overall of a hesitation towards a move toward the cloud. And there seems to be still a lot of trepidation out there about moving out there, especially with what probably constitutes some of your most sensitive data, that being clinical data rather than just faculty, staff, sort of administrative data. And the concerns about the data control were paramount. So you'll note on this slide that there's, obviously, like I just said, there's still a large majority that are only on local servers maintained by your IT department. And you can reread the question, but how are your clinical data stored currently? So that was 64%. We're still just local storage. We had about 22% that had moved entirely to cloud providers, and then a smaller segment, 14%, that said they were using some sort of hybrid, not unlike UC Irvine, where Patty is. What was interesting was how the responses varied or how the responses to the questions that followed in the survey varied based on whether people were local or cloud-based, because you might make assumptions, well, if you're in the cloud, you're going to be a lot stricter about security or vice versa and whatnot. And so as we break down the answers and the questions in the preceding slides, you'll see how it's interesting what we saw. I just want to do a quick show of hands, since we didn't have a massive number of respondents to our survey. Can I see a show of hands of those law schools who are now using a cloud-based solution for case management? And how about local storage? Okay, so there you go. It kind of dovetails with our results of the survey. Still, I think there's a greater number of folks. And there are still the same players really in this market space. I mean, you still have Time Matters and Lexis. You've got Amicus Attorney. And on the cloud side, I think the leaders really are Clio and Rocket Matter, although there's other little ones kind of cropping up here and there. So then we asked, regardless of whether you're local or cloud-based in your case management platform, do you have policies in place prohibiting the use of cloud services such as Dropbox, Google Docs, etc.? And interestingly, it was a 50-50 split. So despite the previous slide indicating that a lot of people were still local, even the cloud vendors, or even the schools that have gone to the cloud, were in fact leery of other cloud-based solutions. And I think Patty's going to talk a little bit more in detail about that here.
So what we found, okay, so this is overall for all institutions, regardless of local or cloud. 40% said no Google Docs, 40% said no Dropbox. One person said all cloud services, don't use any of them. And another one said other, which was really anything based outside of Canada, I think was the other. So it must have been a Canadian respondent. What I found interesting about this statistic was that for those that have actually moved to the cloud, I gotta make sure I'm looking at this right. For those that actually moved to the cloud, they are the ones that were most concerned about other cloud provided services. Whereas the ones that were still local, they didn't care to talk about cloud provided services. They were like, everything on the clinic is locally stored, it's controlled, I don't need to worry about anything else. So that I thought was an interesting statistic. For those that have moved to the cloud, we want to be sure that you do differentiate to your clinical faculty and students that there is a big difference between what we've said is okay on the cloud. So the contract that we have with company X is okay to use, but that doesn't mean that it's a blanket okay for cloud provided services. And I think that some students, when they sit, they go, oh, well, this is cloud, so I can do this. Some of the products that we actually, like Clio, they have plugins to work with Google Docs or Dropbox. And so if you enable those options, the student may think, because they seamlessly work with the product, that those products are also okay to use. So be clear if you do move to the cloud that other cloud provided services may not necessarily be okay to use.
All right, so then, again, regardless of whether you're a cloud-based case management school or not, how do you educate clinical faculty and students about the risks of storing data electronically? So that could mean local or cloud-based. And you see here that the blue is in-person training. So again, this is everybody. So I mean, most, well, not most, I guess less than a majority of the respondents are providing in-person training. But both cloud-based schools and local storage respondents definitely provide that. 25% said they provide online documentation, obvious enough. 15% were providing email sorts of training. And then the last little section over here, the purple, is 15%. We don't provide training. We assume it's common sense. So that was interesting because everybody who said we don't was a school that did local storage only. Now, some of them did do other kinds of training, but all that 15%, there were no cloud-based schools in that little 15% chunk. So basically, all the schools that have moved to the cloud, again, kind of echoing what Patty said, feel that it's important to do that sort of end-user education, maybe more so than if you're still storing your data locally, because maybe perhaps you as IT folks or faculty take it for granted that students are not going to be storing things in weird places because they've got this sort of more contained, controlled environment. I'm not sure I agree with that in this day and age of bring your own device, which we're going to talk about coming up here, and sort of the mobile challenges that we face now. But in any case, it seemed like the schools that had already moved to a cloud-based case management platform were really focused on that end-user education. One thing to stress is that if there are institutions that have moved to the cloud, there should be some sort of education about risks of accessing data via a browser or a mobile device. Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but you get into the concern about shadow copies and where they're being stored. If you're downloading documents, are they being saved to a local drive? What happens if somebody opens up an attachment in Outlook or their email client and they're not right-clicking and doing save as, which I try to impress upon people all the time, but they just do the old double-click and it ends up buried in that deeply buried Outlook temp directory that we all love in Windows, or Mac for that matter. And that's a challenge that we face, and that's something that came up during our move to Clio as faculty got used to the workflow of sort of, okay, well, it's not got any inline editing tools. It's not like a Google Docs environment where when you access a document from within the case management platform, you can do inline editing. People upload and then they download. They upload and they download. Now it's got a really rich and robust versioning feature, so you can keep track of versions of documents, and as they get redlined or edited, that's pretty robust and convenient. But we did have to think through that, and that's why we put into place some policies that would protect against those sort of shadow copies and copies ending up in places where you really don't want them to be. So that's what we're talking about here, and the font is a little light up here. You can probably see it better on the screens. But how do you handle access to clinical data from mobile devices? Choose all and apply. And again, this was for schools that were using both cloud-based solutions and local storage. So really, regardless, I think this is something you're hearing about in other sessions, and something that's in the news all the time in higher ed IT is this whole, and even in corporate environments, although I think they're maybe a little more controlled and top down in the way it's handled. But the whole BYOD thing, bring your own device. We've got multiple platforms. You heard the keynote speaker this morning talking a lot about that. And it really is a challenge to those of us who do end user support, just from the standpoint of configuring the devices and making sure that they're on our networks and whatnot. But when you raise it to this level of talking about, are they going to be accessing sensitive data, it's a whole different ballgame. And the Information Security Office people get nervous, University Council people get nervous, and that's where we really had to put some focus. So one of the things that stands out here is how many people said other. So I'll cover these in a second, but since this is such a large chunk, I wanted to touch on what people said who responded other to this question. One was just put a password on the device. We all know it's pretty simple to put a 4-digit code on your iPhone. I think the same is true of Android devices, and our Information Security Office considers that secure enough. I was kind of surprised by that, actually, but there's no additional security that needs to take place on an iPhone, for instance, or an iPad, as far as our Chief Information Security Officer is concerned. It's considered secure enough if you password protect that device. Some may argue that it's not, but that's our UNC policy. Other folks said simply Time Matter server cannot be accessed via mobile devices at all. Another person said they don't have a policy yet. Someone said they're using secure SharePoint, Microsoft SharePoint with SSL encryption. So that's another approach. And then one faculty member, or one person responded, only faculty can have access via VPN, and it's very slow and restrictive, so no access when using a phone or other mobile device. As a result, email is overused, which sort of then gets you into other problems. But so again, we see here that among this other category, there are quite a diversity of responses. There's a number of different approaches to managing this, I think. And one of the things we tried to do initially with Time Matters, even when we were still on that platform, and people were wanting to access them from their laptops, is we set up a virtual desktop through Citrix. Our campus has a Citrix virtualization project that's maintained centrally by ITS. We didn't have anything local at that time. We do now, as a matter of fact. But so we set up this custom law school Citrix desktop, and students would go in through the ITS webpage to launch that virtual machine. They'd have to sort of sign up for it ahead of time, and it was cumbersome. And again, we had issues with the Mac people being able to launch that Windows desktop. And what we did is we just installed Time Matters Enterprise Edition on that virtual desktop so people could run it remotely but securely. So that's one approach. When you get into email, I mean, that's just sort of a nightmare because people take for granted that email is sort of private and secure, and it's really not. I mean, once it leaves your computer, there's a lot more potential for email to get out there in the wild than I think other ways of file sharing. And your mileage may vary in terms of protecting your data as far as email goes. One solution that UNC has taken it upon itself to implement, and this was largely due to a big push from our med school. We're a big campus, big state university, so we had a lot of liability. And the med school wanted a solution, and so they went out on a product. Well, this was in tandem with Central ITS, and they implemented something called Cisco Iron Port. That's the hardware sort of layer, and the service itself is called Registered Envelope Service. I don't know, has anybody heard of that here? Is anybody familiar with that? one person. So I'm not overly familiar with it, but what it is, it's actually kind of slick. If you're on your UNC email account, all you have to do is in parens put secure in the subject line. By doing that, it triggers this middleware layer whereby your email will then get handled by the Cisco iron ports and this registered envelope service, and the recipient gets an email that says, you have a secure message waiting for you. And they actually have to click an HTML link, and it's at that point it's HTML based, and that's the only way they can get to that email message, both the body, the text of the message, and any attachments. It works pretty seamlessly, but I just wanted to note that when I brought this up during the initial training with our clinical staff, this was after we moved to Clio, but we were trying to look at all of our security at that point and take a deeper look at how we were doing things. I said to the director of our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic, this is something that you may really want to consider anytime you're sending email to an external agency, federal agency, or one of your clients who's involved in an immigration case. It may behoove you to use this secure email messaging capability that we've got. It's no extra charge to the law school. It's maintained centrally. And she just laughed and she said, Doug, you don't understand. These federal agencies, like even the IHS, is that it? Immigration, INS? INS. They want us to send them messages with people's immigration numbers and social security numbers in clear text in the body of the email. They won't even look at stuff. If we send them some secure message and they've got to click on links, the bureaucracy is way worse at the federal level than it is at our level. So even if you find resistance among your faculty to doing things like that and really ratcheting down on your security, I think it's just worth noting that you're going to be up against some external forces that may prevent you from being as secure as you might otherwise be.
So the next question we asked in our survey was, do you have any formal procedures in place to monitor how clinical data is being stored? And across the board, everyone said no, except for one institution that said they utilize encryption and have full logging. And of course, that was somebody where all data was stored locally. The one person did provide a no comment, which was actually Doug.
I confess.
Better policies for monitoring this, because all the storage data stored within Clio, some users are still saving data to their network drive. One thing that I guess I wanted to underscore here is that when people are storing things locally, you have full control, of course, of your data, which means you have all logging capability, right? You know exactly who's accessed your server, you know who's touched the file. When you move to the cloud, you lose some of this. So with Clio, they've got a nice firm feed where it allows you to see who may have updated a file, but it doesn't give you the capability of knowing, oh, somebody particularly accessed this, they accessed the file from a particular location. So I asked if some other institutions have been looking at other tools to maybe help with this. And one particular product that one of the institutions was looking at, which actually I think I saw in TechNoise, was Watchdogs. And I'm going to preface everything I'm about to say is I'm not an expert in Watchdogs. I did my own little research on their site. But my understanding of how Watchdogs works is it provides a plugin at the desktop or a mobile device, and it will allow you to send documents and protect features of that document. So you can actually send a document as an attachment in email and prevent printing it, copying and pasting from it, editing it, saving it. You can even actually expire a document from being opened if you decide to at the Watchdogs site. So the Watchdogs is actually stored on a server, but when it's attached, you can actually open it if you have a Watchdogs plugin to open that. The nice thing also that Watchdogs allows you to do is it'll allow you, it actually tells you what kind of device opened it, where in the world it opened it, and whether or not someone printed it or edited it. And if you have this, they have this watermark feature where somebody says, well, if it's on screen, someone could take a picture of it. Well, the watermark will actually tell you who opened the document. So if someone does take a picture of it, you can actually see who was the one that allowed the picture to be taken. So that might be a product that you might want to look at for better logging of your documents if you're very concerned about them. The other thing that's great about Watchdogs is it's not completely cloud-based. So a lot of the products you hear about, their solution is always, no, we're completely hosted. We don't have an on-prem option. Well, Watchdogs actually does have an on-prem option. So if you're still wanting full control of some of your files, you can install Watchdogs locally. Another product that an institution was looking at was called Citrix Sharefile. And this product is actually a secure version of Dropbox. And what this does is it allows you to sync tools just like Dropbox does, but has more control over those files so you can expire them, change access to them. So those are a couple of products that you may want to look at if you do decide to move to the cloud.
Another one that, in some of these products, some of the cloud vendors have pretty tight integration with. I don't know as much with Rocket Matter, but with Clio, they have really good APIs with Box.net, Dropbox, and now, more recently and more appealing to me because I think it's much more secure, is NetDocuments. And NetDocuments is kind of like Watchdogs. I think it's although maybe even more geared towards the legal market, they're really focused on the legal market and making security is sort of their number one priority. And so with that integration between Clio and NetDocuments, you could get into a situation where you do have that greater and deeper, more granular level of logging.
The other tool that you might want to consider if you do decide to allow people to use Google Docs, because a lot of our students came to me and they said, okay, I like Google Docs because I can synchronously edit the document. And you're not giving me any other, quote, secure alternative to this, so why can't I just use this for certain things? And so there's another product called Cipherdocs, which is a Mozilla plugin where it will actually encrypt your Google Doc as you edit it. So something else to look at if you do decide to allow Google Docs.
Yeah, just so I'm putting my own public disclaimer out here about my response. This was based largely on the fact that, do you have any formal procedures in place to monitor? Well, no, it was more based on the fact that I did all the training with the clinical students and the faculty and trusted that they were following the drill, but I recently learned that our Center for Civil Rights had this big case with one of the rural counties in North Carolina. They do some great work, but I was sort of flummoxed when I found out that they were still saving stuff up to what we call the G drive, the group shared drive. And I was like, really? You guys are doing that? How long have you been doing that? Oh, for months. We've had this huge case, and we didn't get it really into Clio yet. So it just goes to show you that, even in areas or schools that have adopted these sorts of platforms, you've got to kind of have to be vigilant and stay on top of your user base.
So the next question we asked on the survey was, what types of tools, if any, does your IT unit provide and support to help secure clinical information? And we broke the responses up into two sections, one local storage and one cloud, which Doug will cover. So local storage, as you can see from the responses, they're very used to controlling their data. So one person said they rely solely on their university's ITS security department. Another institution said they limit ports on their Time Matters server and they rely on Time Matters password protection. A couple of institutions actually did have documentation on disk encryption for Macs and Windows. So that can actually port over if you do move to the cloud. Limiting workstations within the clinic. So limiting access to clinical data only to workstations in the clinic. This is going to be difficult to do if you move to the cloud because students will know that they can access it from anywhere. So that will be a challenge if those institutions decide to move to the cloud. Remote users must use encrypted VPN to REP into a workstation. Again, can't really control it because it's on the cloud and they know it's all browser-based, so they know they can access it from anywhere. Email policy and VPN for faculty with data on a separate server. So we do that too. We still do the VPN for faculty and students with separate data on a secure file storage.
So the same question, but for those folks who are already, dealing with cloud storage and case management systems. So we already covered some of these points when we talked about how to protect mobile devices, but I wanted to take a moment on this first one on its sort of local encryption. So we, as a university, again, because security is so paramount and we're a public institution and we've had some big data breaches that made the local and even national news, we're one medical school faculty person was actually fired, and a tenured professor was fired, and then later sued the university and got rehired, and it was a real mess for my friends over at the med school who do IT. But so one of the policies that came out of that campus-wide was that any laptop that touches sensitive data has to have its hard drive fully encrypted. So we're talking whole disk encryption now. Now, they're not applying that to phones because, again, 4-digit passcode is considered secure enough, but for any laptop. And so Central ITS is providing a solution that we use. It's PGP encryption, whole disk encryption. I think it got bought by somebody recently, I can't recall, but it's, all the keys are maintained by a PGP server on campus, so we have to ask this. So we have a little form that's filled out whenever a faculty member orders a new laptop, and this is regardless of whether they're in the clinic or not. So we have dozens of faculty who get laptops with their professional development funds every year. And we ask them, is this laptop, or are you going to be accessing sensitive data? And we have a whole list of what that may entail, PHI, HIPAA, all the usual stuff. And if they say yes to any of those questions, any one question, then we've got to say, okay, we've got to encrypt your hard drive. So with PGP, that's how we handle the Windows laptops. With the Macs, and again, I'm not talking about students. That was a road we did not want to go down, so I'll talk about that as far as the flash drives go. But for faculty and staff who bought Mac laptops, luckily with the advent of OS 10.7, when Lion came out, they started offering whole disk encryption. Until then, you could sort of encrypt the user profile, but not the whole hard drive. And with 10.7, you can now do WDE, and just using the built-in security features in Mac OS. So we do the same thing. We'll encrypt the entire hard drive. If there's a lot of data, it takes some time to encrypt, in talking a couple hours, few hours. If it's a brand new laptop, I usually just encrypt it right from the get-go, knowing that that person is going to have sensitive data. Yeah?
Just a quick question. Excuse my voice. PGP is why you use BitLockers, or is it because not every computer they show up with doesn't have a TPM, so you don't worry about that?
That's a fair question, and I'll actually touch on that when I talk about the local flash drive encryption. BitLocker, as far as I know, there's no like BitLocker Enterprise Edition where it can be checking in with a server, and with PGP, it literally checks in to make sure that those laptops that we do with PGP whole disk encryption are still locked and still protected. And if they see something, like if there's a breach, they can lock it down and things like that. With BitLocker, that's just like a local Windows only thing. But yeah.
We actually have reporting for ours with BitLocker using System-Centric Config Manager.
Oh, okay.
You have to do some modifications and make a custom report, but then it can tell you as of the last check-in date, yeah, this drive was encrypted, this drive was not.
That's good to know because we just adopted SCCM on our campus, so that's good information. So sort of along similar lines though, so what we did for the students, because we didn't want to go down that path of encrypting personally owned laptops. I mean, in the case of the faculty, we own the laptop, whether they like to believe it or not. Have faculty get a $2,000 MacBook with their PD money, and then a month later they get a job at Washington Law, and they're saying, "Can I take my MacBook?" And I say, "No, you really can't. That doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the state of North Carolina." At which point I have to close my door before they throw something at me. But so for students, we didn't want to start encrypting personally on devices. And so what we did when we adopted Clio, this was not something we had done with Time Matters. We bought flash drives for all the 70 students. Again, we have a finite number. It's not all our students, like in Patty's case. But we had a manageable number of students taking clinic. And so we bought each one of them a flash drive. And we did a poll, how many of you folks are going to be using MacBooks, how many Windows laptops? And again, the clinic staff was very helpful in all this. And then we used TrueCrypt, which is a free open source solution to encrypt those flash drives. If we had 25 Mac users, we encrypted them for Mac OS, and the Windows users got Windows encrypted flash drives. And during the training that we conduct every semester for new incoming clinic students, we make that the last segment of the training. So we train them on Clio, we talk about best practices, workflow, and document versioning and all that. And then we say, thou shalt not save work anywhere but this encrypted flash drive. And in order to, mount the drive on their local laptop, they've got to enter a password. If they lose the drive in a coffee shop or leave it in the law library or lying around the law school and somebody finds it, they're not going to be able to get to that data. They're just not, because it doesn't even mount when you stick it in the USB drive. So that was the approach that we took. I've had people, when I've consulted with other folks who are thinking about Clio, tell me, God, that sounds like an administrative nightmare. But it really hasn't been, because the students have to take ownership and responsibility for that flash drive. We have a spreadsheet that has a serial number of which drive they got. If they lose it, then we keep track of that stuff. And they have to turn it back in at the end of their clinical experience, and then we wipe all the data off and refresh them for the next year's class. So it's not a year-over-year expense even. It was like a one-time outlay of cash, and we continue to use those from year to year. So other types of protection that people said they're doing for storage in the cloud, password protection at the file level. If you're uploading a PDF, maybe again, a federal form that requires you to fill it out, you could password protect that PDF file perhaps. Data scanning software, although I don't know much about what people were referring to when they answered that. There's this data loss prevention. So one of our respondents said McAfee provides, an enterprise level data loss prevention platform they were leveraging. Again, virtualization. I talked about the secure email through middleware through that Cisco Ironport registered envelope service. And then real quickly, we're doing okay on time, log off scripts. So we're in an Active Directory environment at Carolina Law, and so almost all the clinical faculty have PCs still as their primary computer, even despite the growth of the Mac use. Their primary computer is still a Windows 7 desktop, and my sysadmin just wrote a log-off script. So every time they log off, it cleans out all those temp files. It's pretty basic, sort of brute force approach to cleansing the local hard drives, but it's effective, and it does the job. So if they did click on an attachment that was clinic related and they ended up with a shadow copy, they're typically going to log off at least once a week. It's going to take that data away. I just recently discovered a really cool Apple user forum that talked about writing an Apple script for MacBooks. So I'm going to explore that. That's not something we've done yet, but it might even be the type of thing where I can save it as a little Apple script, tell the students who are using Macs to save it to their Finder, and every couple days, even though they're supposed to be saving stuff to that flash drive, just as an added measure, or even for those clinic faculty who use MacBooks, you could run and execute that script and remove the temp files on the Mac. And I'll have a URL to share with you on that.
Okay, so I think this is the final question. The final question was, how do your clinical faculty staff students share information with clients and opposing counsel? And what I found interesting, that was overwhelmingly everyone said email, which is very insecure. The interesting thing that statistically between local and cloud was that all of these other ones, Secure FTP server, Secure FTP server and a client portal, those were all cloud-based. The third-party cloud storage, which our examples were Dropbox and Box.net, so someone's actually using Dropbox and Box.net to share information with clients and opposing counsel. Those were locally stored people. And then other was kind of odd answers, like I have to check with the clinical faculty, and an encrypted email, so they use encrypted email. So I guess the thing to stress here is email is not secure. So we might want to look at other products like the client portal. I know Clio, as an example, has Clio Connect that allows you to log in and get information securely, and you can create client accounts, right?
Yes.
So that they can access the
Exactly.
information. So that is an option. Or if you think about your brokerage accounts, they never send all of your financial information via email. They always say, we have information, click on this to get it. So look at possible solutions for that if you're going to communicate via email. Okay, and then I wanted to take a few minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I wanted to take a few minutes about information security, and what I wanted to say here was that if your institution is not providing information security to your faculty and students, it might be something that you should do. I work closely with the information security officer on our central campus to talk to the clinical faculty and students about information security. And some of the things that I cover are the organization and personal risks with a possible breach in your information. And so I often try and sit down with the group and I say, okay, think of yourself as an attorney and your files were just stolen. So you have to now sit down with the client and tell them that you've just lost all of their files. Or you have to sit down with the rest of your legal team and say, yeah, you know that thing that we worked on for days and weeks, I lost it, it's been taken away. So those are some of the things that I sort of underscore with them. I also talk about stolen credentials. So I know that a lot of the students these days are aware of phishing and malware attempts and things like that, but I still underscore, phishing attempts, it doesn't matter how many protections we put in place on your data. If your credentials are stolen, they now have access to everything that you have access to. So I underscore, be aware of phishing attempts, and I actually give examples of what they look like. Be aware of keyloggers, especially in airports. Don't go logging on to an airport public machine and access all of your clinical information. I also cover socially engineered threats. So people cold calling to get information about what you might be working on, cooler talk in a particular firm where you may not necessarily know the person. Oh, I'm from accounting, how's that case going? So I cover those kinds of things. I also make sure that the students are aware that if they're sitting in a coffee shop and they're all on a team and they're working on a case, they have to be aware of their surroundings, right? So if someone overhears a conversation, they actually might be leaking information that they don't necessarily want to do. So I cover that. The other thing I cover is mobile devices. And I ask the question, how many of you actually password protect your laptop and your phone? So actually, in this room, how many actually password protect your laptop and your phone? Okay, good, yay, the majority of the people. So usually when I say this at the beginning of every term, I have half the class, or half the room, say yes, and half the room, they say no. So then my follow-up question is, okay, well how many of you say save my password in a browser-based app? Because it's convenient, right? So these are the people that say, I don't password protect my device and I cache my passwords. So then I ask, okay, well do you leave your car unlocked?
Yes.
And do you leave your keys in your car?
Not now. Growing up, my parents always did though.
Okay, so that's convenient. But
What's your
if you think
name?
about
What's your street address? More importantly.
So,
yeah.
if I could comment, I'm a little paranoid about security, just a little bit. and so my dilemma was, for the longest time, I didn't want to store my password, but I have a strong password on my computer, and my thing is encrypted, and I have my password stored. And the reason why, and this might be a little retentive, is that a lot of times a student would come in, and I'd have to log into a service with them standing there staring at me. And I'd rather not be entering in on some systems we have, we have a secure password card where the password changes every time. And you type in the PIN without them looking.
Right.
So.
But you still password protect your laptop.
I know, but I'm saying I see the argument to storing in browser as long as you're not using some of the iCloud or other services where it's being synced up to the cloud. Only because I don't want to type my password in front of a student.
But for those of us who have moved to like a cloud-based case management system, they sure as hell better not be saving their Clio password in the browser, because then you're toast. Then it totally defeats the purpose of all the layers of security that the vendor has gone through the trouble of ensuring. So, I'm a real stickler about caching passwords in the browser.
We just cleaned malware off someone's machine. I think was doing screenshots. Periodic screenshots.
Yeah, it's a war zone out there.
Why does the vendor then have that facility available?
Well, that's a browser-based thing. It's hard to prevent, I think, when you're a web-based.
No, but in the Clio, when you go to the Clio sign-in page, there's a checkbox for that. I'm pretty sure.
Oh, remember me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I think you're right.
Some browsers will do it, but you know.
I thought there was not, but.
Well, that's store the username or the
No, we should probably tell them.
Yeah, I'll go out and rattle George's cage out there in the vendor area after the presentation. But no, that's a good point.
But I guess my point is that if that laptop is stolen, they now have full access to everything that particular user had access to. And so I underscore with the users that don't do that. The other thing I cover is physical security. So I don't know if you've seen the clip on YouTube, but how long do you think it takes to steal a password out of the front seat of a car? There's a YouTube video that actually shows that it takes 30 seconds to do this. So I run this and all the students go, wow, it's really that fast. So I say, okay, don't leave it on the front seat of a car, don't leave it visible where anybody can take it. And then, again, like I said before, I strongly recommend different passwords for different services. The other thing that I talk about is cloud-based services and what exactly you're doing when you use these products. So think about a guy standing on a corner with a sign above his head that says, free data storage, I promise it's secure, right? So would you go, okay, here's my case file, you promise you're going to keep it for me, right? Safe and sound in a locked vault. So that's kind of what you're doing with cloud-provided services if you haven't reviewed the contract that you're agreeing to. So, I underscore, do you really know who has access to your data if you store it on the cloud? How do you know where it's stored? And do they really have good security and privacy policies? So those are some of the things that I cover with our students and our faculty before every term, just to make sure that they know why we have all these crazy policies that they think are crazy.
I'm going to bring all these up at the same time, which I don't normally like to do, but the last point here is one that Patty just spoke about, and we're also running a little low on time. It's about 53 minutes, so we'll finish up here in a couple minutes. Leave time for questions. Carefully review your SLAs and contracts. There's a whole other session on this I saw on the Cali schedule on Saturday morning, or it's like the last session on Saturday, so maybe not everyone can attend that one, but it was good to see that because I think we, not all of us IT people that work in law schools have JDs. I don't, but I've reviewed many a contract in my time and have looked very carefully at the language, and maybe that is my English undergrad degree lending itself to my skill set now, but I'm a real stickler for reading through and kind of seeing what the hell does this say and what am I agreeing to. I certainly don't read EULAs, I don't think anybody does, but when it comes to an SLA with a contract provider that I'm about to stake my career on, when we're leaving Time Matters behind and going to this cloud vendor that was an untested thing, you better believe I read the SLA with Clio. And there were some parts about it that I was in total agreement with the University Council and the Information Security Office about when they had their problems with it. Now, there were other parts of it that I didn't have as much issue with, that I was like, look, this vendor, Clio, is not just any cloud-based vendor. They're a cloud-based vendor that is dealing with attorneys. That's their whole customer base. So clearly they're going to have SAS 70 data center certification, and they're going to have geolocation, and they're going to have first notice clauses, which they didn't actually. We had to arm wrestle them for that one. So those are the types of things, are they going to give away your data if they get subpoenaed? You have to make sure that you get the first right of refusal on that, and that is in writing in the SLA. Because a lot of these cloud vendors, at least with my experience with Clio, they have a boilerplate. I mean, they're just going to have a boilerplate SLA or terms and conditions that you're going to have to agree to. But I will say, and I think some other schools that have gone the route of Clio since we went in the fall of 2011, they're very amenable to working with your legal counsel, your university-wide counsel, to hammer out those terms. Yes, you may have a slightly different agreement than another school, but that's how the game gets played. So don't just assume that when you get that agreement from some cloud provider that you have to abide by it. You can really try to negotiate those terms. The other thing is differentiation is crucial. Again, this gets back to the fact that even those schools like ourselves who have gone to Clio or gone to another cloud-based system, we don't allow them to tie in with Google Docs. We don't allow them to use Dropbox. And not all cloud providers are created equal. I think that's the takeaway here. And you really do have to differentiate, because to your users, the cloud is the cloud. And it's this wonderful thing. And they see the consumer versions of it like iCloud, even though our keynote guy joked about that this morning, not working as designed. But they just want to use this stuff. So you have to kind of, funnel them into the right solutions that are going to be secure, especially in this context of clinical users. Develop written standard operating procedures and policies. And again, don't go it alone. Don't go rogue and think, I'm going to champion this and I'm going to work this out on behalf of my law school and I'm going to be the best loved guy in the department or best loved woman in the department. Definitely involve your information security people and involve university counsel, because then it's kind of a CYA. I mean, you're kind of covering your own ass, but frankly, you're limiting the liability of your whole institution by doing that. So I'm going to leave, and back up your data. Even with Clio, we use their escrow service. There's a little escrow plugin, and we back up all our Clio data. Patty does too, to the Amazon cloud, which I guess you could then argue, well, then you got your data out in the Amazon cloud and you're exposing yourself, but that was something I wanted to do, so we choose to do it. Here's the, some tiny URLs and some real URLs that point to some of the solutions we mentioned. For those Mac nerds out there, I was thrilled when I found this forum about, scripting temp file removal. So I'll leave that up on the screen for a minute. I think the only other slide we have after this just lists our contact info and says questions. So have at it if anybody has any questions.
Since I'm already kind of the butt of the joke, and I'll have you know I just took Control-Alt-Delete off this laptop too. I just installed Windows the other day, so it's still on by default.
Yeah.
I don't believe in typing passwords. Who's the onus on? Like, if no one else is stepping up and driving this conversation, I've never heard from our general counsel. I don't know who the security officers even are.
And you're at your entire university, you mean?
Yeah.
So what happens then when there's a data breach and your dean comes to you and says, well, what steps did you take to ensure that you were securing data?
I wouldn't even know there was a breach.
Are you public or private?
Public.
Public. Then the state probably has a set of guidelines.
Okay.
You're supposed to follow.
Yeah, I mean,
So it'd just be an issue of finding the right person to ask that question to.
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, no offense, Chris, in all due respect, I think that, you may not know who that person is, but I think it's your obligation to find out who it is and really try to, to reach out to those people on campus who can help you through these things. Because again, I'm not an attorney and I'm also not CISP certified. I mean, I'm not a security guy by trade. And so I relied on those folks to kind of pick through this with a fine tooth comb and make some recommendations about some of the things to look out for.
Okay.
So don't, I think the takeaway is don't try to go it alone just out of some sense of pride, like you want to appear like you know everything about everything. It's better to have somebody backing you up.
In our campus, we actually have an information security officer that's driving it. So
Okay.
he wants to ensure that any sensitive information, in the University of California system, we are required to provide an inventory of all sensitive and restricted information.
Mhm.
And when we brought the law school to our campus, they were clear that attorney-client was sensitive enough to fall into this inventory. And so even though it's not, I think it's IS3 as far as restricted for identifiable information, we're still required to inventory it. So by inventorying it, we have to know if there is a breach, we are responsible for following up on that.
We got a few questions. Let's go there.
Yeah, it seems like everybody's using Dropbox, so I was wondering, for us non-IT people, what exactly is the problem with using Dropbox? Because I understand what you're saying, it's a huge problem just generally with students using email, flash drives that are not encrypted, saving documents on their local, but what about Dropbox?
So I'm a big fan of Dropbox, but for non-sensitive data. I mean, that's the distinction I always make for my faculty, because I think it's a great collaborative tool. I mean, we did our presentation by creating a Dropbox folder and sharing stuff with each other. Of course, she hijacked it somehow. I don't know.
I missed it.
Yeah. So we ended up with 2 folders, but just teasing. But we did, I think it's great, and I put a lot of personal stuff in Dropbox as long as it doesn't have my SSN or anything like that, or a bank number. And I talk to faculty about making those sorts of distinctions. So as long as they're not dealing with student information that would be like a FERPA violation, things that, we talk about HIPAA, we talk about PHI, but you gotta remember FERPA, we have all these acronyms. And that's critical, because if you put some student's grade or some letter of complaint that a student wrote to you as a faculty member, and you say, hey, I want to share it with a colleague who's over at some other law school, and I don't want to email it to them, so I'm going to cover my butt, and I'm going to put it up in bad idea, because if that gets, it's just the liability of sort of that sensitive information. But I think Dropbox is a great tool for consumers and even for higher ed constituents to a limited degree.
And Dropbox in general is just not secure. I don't know, if you look up Dropbox security problems, you'll see a few articles on breaches that Dropbox has actually had. And so if for whatever reason you have sensitive information, you don't want to expose yourself to potential problems with the product itself.
Honestly, just consider anything on Dropbox already compromised. Just consider it.
Going through.
This gentleman here, yeah.
Would it be untenable to hand out live CDs to students and have them boot off those to access CLIA, or would there be some either logistical or technical issue.
So you mean not using the local drive to boot off of, like a small Linux kernel or something to boot, thin PC? I hadn't thought of that. I mean, part of the trade-off when you go to the cloud, like Patty said, is it's accessible from anywhere, and that's why it's become so popular for us, is that students love it, the faculty love it, they can get to it from anywhere, whereas with a client-server model or with Time Matters, it was just so difficult and cumbersome. So I think it's increased the workflow and it's increased the productivity, while we've managed the security liability and tried to keep that in check. It's an interesting idea. I don't think there'd be anything preventing you from it, because once you boot off that kernel, just open up a browser. As long as there's a browser as part of that mini OS.
The only thing is, if they know what the URL is, they can still go to another machine and access it. So if you can work with Clio to possibly limit, I don't know, an IP range, I guess.
You can do IP-based filtering in Clio. We don't do it. We do, however, encourage and sort of require. It's hard because the user himself or herself can go in and deactivate it, uncheck the button. But it's there's Evil Knievel. I love Evil Knievel. You can require what's called what's the term now? Two-factor authentication. So when they log in, then they get sent a little PIN code to their email account. So even if someone hacks their Clio password, they still can't get in unless they also know their credentials to their email account. That's something that we really encourage students to do. But again, unfortunately, we've discovered that they can go in and just like uncheck the box if they find it annoying. Sometimes we police it and we'll tell them you have to re-enable it. You've got to use two-factor authentication.
I had a question about, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, we'll get one more in after.
Google app, Google Docs.
Yes.
Do you have Google Apps at your institution?
UC Irvine does have Google Apps. For
And
education.
still you decided not to allow Google Docs to work with Clio?
Well, Google Doc, my understanding on the language between UC and Google, it doesn't necessarily guarantee security. It does guarantee the ability for you to work with Google on logging and things like that, but there's no additional security, from my understanding, than just regular Google.
And for us, we were afraid that, we vetted the contract and the terms and conditions of the Clio agreement with the University Council and the Security Office, and they eventually signed off on it and blessed it. But, again, allowing that third-party integration, that's a whole other can of worms you're kind of opening up. So again, with our students, even though a lot of them do use Gmail, even though we're a Microsoft Live at EDU campus and they have Live at EDU addresses, they'll forward their mail to Gmail. We told them that the only address from which they can access Clio and that they have to use within Clio is their Carolina, official address. And you have to be the senior administrator within Clio to enable Google Drive integration or Dropbox integration or Box or even Net Documents. So I just simply haven't enabled those features.
Okay, thank you.
This gentleman in the very back, last question.
Quickly back to the separate email issue. Are you managing that on separate email servers? And related to that, are you encouraging or do you have a policy for metadata scrubbing on attachments that are sent out to opposing counsel?
So to the second question, no, we are not doing any metadata scrubbing. To the first question, yes, we are managing separate clinical email accounts, not on separate servers. We actually use our Google Apps for Education for the clinical email accounts.
Okay, so that's on the cloud kind of, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But it's in the controlled environment of Google Apps for Education. One thing that was interesting was one student got their regular Google email account breached or compromised. And if you go into Google Mail, there's a last 10 logins, and it'll tell you what IP and all of that. So I went, and the student had already logged in like 10 times, and so it just showed the last 10 minutes or something like that. But with Google Apps for Education, you have access to more logging if you have a contract with your institution in Google.
Well, we've gone over by a little bit. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Thanks so much.
Sorry. How you doing? Good. Thank you, sir. Have a great day. All right, young man. Well, thank you.
So, you're fine.